Mara Vale, 32-year-old wife of Nolan, stood in the middle of Grant Vale's mansion driveway while rain soaked through her simple dress and her suitcase lay open on the wet stone. Nolan Vale, 36-year-old husband of Mara and son of Grant, pointed toward the front gate in front of staff, family, guests, security and said, "Get out, Mara. You are financially useless. You came into my father's mansion with nothing and you'll leave with nothing." Everyone heard it. Ruth Vale, 63-year-old mother of Nolan, stood on the front steps with a cold smile. Paige Wynn, 34-year-old secret lover of Nolan, stood under Nolan's umbrella wearing a cream coat, looking at Mara like she had already replaced her. June Harris, 57-year-old housekeeper of the Vale family, lowered her eyes. Cal Mercer, 45-year-old security supervisor for Grant, almost stepped forward, then stopped because the mansion cameras were already recording everything. Mara's fingers shook as she gathered her wet papers from the driveway. Her hair clung to her face. Her wedding photo lay face down near Nolan's car. To everyone watching, she looked powerless, embarrassed, and thrown away. But Nolan did not know one thing. That same morning, Mara had received a confidential legal confirmation from Hale Finch Estate Management. Her late father's probate had finalized. She had inherited majority ownership and managing authority over the private estate management company, valued at $240 million. And Hale Finch was not just any company. For years, it had managed luxury estate taxes, property filings, compliance reviews, and risk reports for Grant Vale, 68-year-old father of Nolan and owner of several high-value estates. Because Hale Finch used coded client files, Mara had once reviewed pieces of Grant's records without knowing the client was her own husband's family. Those quiet corrections had protected the Vale estate from $18.6 million in penalties, interest, and forced restructuring exposure. Some of those corrections carried Mara's own initials. Then Nolan made his final mistake. He laughed, threw her suitcase harder, and demanded she stay away from the upcoming estate tax review. That was the moment Mara stopped being the quiet wife everyone underestimated. She picked up the folder, walked through the gate, and let him believe he had won. This is not just a story about public humiliation. It is about what happens when a proud man betrays the only woman who held the records, the legal authority, and the truth powerful enough to silence his whole family. If you believe quiet people should never be mistaken for weak people, subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. Applause almost came too early. Mara Vale, 32, Nolan Vale's wife, and the quiet woman everyone in the Vale family treated like background furniture, stood near the service hallway with a folded speech in one hand and a black pen in the other. Across the ballroom, her husband was about to step onto the small stage in front of donors, business guests, photographers, and half the people he had spent years trying to impress. One wrong name sat in the middle of his speech. One wrong donor. One mistake big enough to embarrass him in front of the room. Mara moved fast. She crossed behind the staff, slipped past a row of white-covered tables, and reached Nolan Vale, 36, Grant Vale's son and Mara's husband, just as he lifted his champagne glass like he already owned the night. "Nolan," she whispered, holding out the page. "The donor's name is Aldridge, not Albright." His smile stayed fixed for the guests, but his eyes flashed with annoyance. "Not now," he muttered. "It is in the third paragraph," Mara said softly. "You are thanking the wrong family. Their foundation gave the largest pledge tonight." For 1 second, panic showed under his polished face. Then he snatched the page, saw the correction, and cleared his throat like the mistake had never existed. A photographer called his name. Nolan turned back to the room and smiled. This was what he did best. He stood under golden lights and made people believe he had built everything himself. The charity dinner was being held at one of Grant Vale's luxury estates, a wide, shining property with polished floors, tall windows, black cars outside, and flowers so expensive they looked almost unreal. Grant Vale, 68, Nolan's father and the owner of several luxury estates, sat near the front of the room in a dark suit, his silver cane resting beside his chair. His health had weakened, but his eyes had not. He watched everything. Nolan stepped onto the stage. "My father built the estate," he said, lifting his glass, "but I built the reputation." The room laughed softly, then applauded. Mara stood near the side wall and felt the familiar sting behind her ribs. She had fixed the donor list. She had corrected the speech. She had quietly moved Mrs. Elston, a major guest with a shellfish allergy, away from the seafood table before anyone noticed the seating mistake. She had caught the unpaid vendor name still printed in the public program and sent a fast message to Nolan's assistant to remove it before the photographers received copies. Nolan knew none of that, or worse, he knew and did not care. When a guest leaned toward him after the speech and said, "Everything tonight is flawless, Nolan," he smiled like a king receiving tribute. "That's what leadership looks like," he said. Mara heard it. She lowered her eyes. Marriage is not a scoreboard, she told herself. She had told herself that many times. When Nolan forgot meetings and she reminded him. When he lost important emails and she recovered them. When he spoke too sharply to people and she softened the damage afterward. She protected him because she loved him, not because he deserved the credit every time. Once, years ago, she had believed there was a good man under all that pride. Love had made her patient. At the far end of the room stood Ruth Vale, 63, Nolan's mother and Mara's mother-in-law, dressed in dark emerald silk with diamonds at her throat. Ruth had the kind of smile that looked warm only from a distance. Up close, it was cold and measuring. She watched Mara moving between problems, fixing things no one thanked her for, and seemed almost irritated that Mara was useful. Near the doors, Cal Mercer, 45, Grant's estate security supervisor, kept his hands folded in front of him. Cal was quiet, loyal to Grant, and observant in the way people often ignored until it was too late. He saw Mara redirect a server before a tray spilled near a donor's wife. He saw Nolan take the praise. He saw Ruth pretend not to see anything. Then Mara's phone vibrated. She stepped into a quiet hallway lined with framed estate photographs. Music softened behind her. The noise of guests faded. The message was from Leela Finch, 51, an attorney and executive counsel for Hale Finch Estate Management, the private company Mara's late father had helped build. Probate confirmation received. Final certificate releases at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. You will become majority owner and managing chair of Hale Finch Estate Management. Updated valuation, $240 million emergency review required on client V19. Call me before you discuss this with anyone. Mara stopped breathing for a moment. $240 million. Her father's company, almost hers in legal control by morning. The hallway seemed to tilt slightly, not because she wanted the money, but because of what it meant. Hale Finch was not just a company, it was her father's life. It managed estates, taxes, trusts, property filings, and private compliance records for families who smiled in public and hid fear in paperwork. A memory rose before she could stop it. Mara was 21 again, standing in her father's small office while rain tapped against the window. Thomas Hale, 58 then, Mara's father and the founder behind Hale Finch's reputation, sat behind a desk covered in files. He had kind eyes, tired hands, and a voice that always became serious around records. The richest families, Thomas had told her, are often protected by the quietest person in the room. Back then, Mara thought he meant accountants, lawyers, assistants, people who checked numbers while wealthy men gave speeches. Now she looked through the hallway opening and saw Nolan laughing under the lights, accepting praise for a night she had saved. She locked her phone. She did not run into the ballroom and announce who she was. She did not tell Ruth. She did not tell Nolan. She did not even call Leela back from the mansion hallway. Because if Hale Finch had an emergency client review, and if the client was connected to the Vale estate, then anything she said before speaking to counsel could create a conflict Nolan would twist against her. So she returned to the dinner. That was Mara's curse, even with hidden power almost in her hand. Love still pulled her back toward the man who kept making her feel small. As she stepped near the stage, she noticed a woman standing too close to Nolan. Paige Wynn, 34, Nolan's image consultant and a new presence in the Vale family's public circle, adjusted Nolan's tie with slow, familiar fingers. She wore a cream dress and a smile that looked soft until it landed on Mara. Nolan did not pull away. Ruth saw it too. She smiled. Mara felt something inside her go still. Paige turned toward her and said, "Nolan needs someone beside him who understands public presence." The insult was gentle enough for the room to miss and sharp enough for Mara to feel. Nolan heard it. He looked at Mara, then at Paige. He could have defended his wife. Instead, he gave a light laugh and said, "Mara prefers the background." The words landed harder than they should have. Mara nodded once, because breaking in public was a luxury she had never allowed herself. In her private encrypted folder called House Records, she had saved copies of corrected drafts, vendor receipts, estate notices, staff messages, and every quiet thing she fixed before it became Nolan's problem. She had never kept them to hurt him. She kept them because her father taught her that memory could be questioned, but records could speak. Across the room, Grant lifted his eyes toward her. A few minutes later, he motioned her closer. Mara bent beside his chair so he would not have to raise his voice. Grant's hand trembled as he touched her wrist. "If my son ever asked you about estate taxes," he whispered, "do not answer him alone." Mara froze. Before she could ask what he meant, Paige appeared behind Nolan near the ballroom doors. Her hand rested lightly on Nolan's wrist, and Nolan did not move it away. The message from Leela burned in Mara's pocket as Grant's warning settled into her chest. By morning, both would become impossible to ignore. The laugh behind Nolan's study door stopped Mara cold. It was not the kind of laugh that belonged in a business meeting. It was soft, private, and too comfortable for a woman who was supposed to be only an image consultant. Mara stood in the dim hallway with Grant's medication notebook pressed against her chest, while rain began tapping against the tall windows behind her. The charity dinner was over. The photographers had left. The donors were gone. Only half-empty champagne glasses remained on silver trays, and the mansion had fallen into that strange silence that came after rich people finished pretending. Mara had been looking for Nolan because Grant wanted him. Grant had asked quietly from his chair, "Tell Nolan I need him to look at the property notice before morning." Mara had nodded, even though she knew Nolan hated being pulled into anything that smelled like responsibility after a night of applause. Now she stood outside his private study, hearing Paige Wynn laugh from inside. The door was not fully closed. A thin line of warm light cut across the hallway carpet. Mara moved closer, not because she wanted to spy, but because something in her body already knew what her heart was begging not to believe. Through the opening, she saw Nolan standing near the desk. Paige was in front of him, adjusting his collar with slow fingers. His hand rested on her waist. On the leather chair behind them lay a cream-colored scarf, the same shade as Paige's dress from the dinner. Mara's breath caught. For a second, she could not move. The man she had protected all evening, the man whose speech she had corrected, the man whose reputation she had saved from 3 quiet disasters, stood there with another woman as if Mara was already gone. Mara pushed the door open. Nolan jerked back first. Paige did not. That hurt more. Nolan's eyes flashed, not with shame but anger. "Why are you sneaking around?" he snapped. Mara stared at him. The question was so cruel, so backward, that for a moment she almost laughed from the shock of it. "I was looking for you," she said. "Your father asked for you." Paige tilted her head and smiled, calm and territorial. "Mara," she said, "you should really knock before entering rooms where adults are discussing business." Mara looked at Nolan. She waited. One word from him would have mattered. One correction. One sentence telling Paige not to speak to his wife that way, but Nolan only straightened his jacket and looked toward the floor. "Paige has been helping me with the family image," he said. "Don't make this ugly." The words landed like a slap without a hand. Mara looked from Nolan to Paige, then back to Nolan. "Is that what you call this?" Before Nolan could answer, footsteps approached from the hall. Ruth appeared at the doorway, perfectly dressed even at that hour, as if she had been waiting nearby for the right moment. Behind her stood June Harris, 57, the Vale family's longtime housekeeper and one of the few staff members who had always treated Mara with quiet kindness. June held an empty tray, but her face tightened when she saw the room. Ruth did not look surprised. That was Mara's first warning that this moment had not happened by accident. "Nolan," Ruth said smoothly, "I warned you. Mara has been unstable ever since Grant started trusting her with little household matters." Mara turned to her. "Unstable?" Ruth sighed as if Mara was proving her point by speaking. "She has been jealous of Paige for weeks," Ruth continued. "She wants to embarrass you because she knows she cannot keep up with your world." Mara felt the room tilt. She looked at Nolan again, waiting for him to question it. Waiting for him to say his mother was wrong. Waiting for him to ask why Paige had been standing so close to him with his hand on her waist. But Nolan believed Ruth instantly, because Ruth's lie gave him exactly what he wanted. It made Mara the problem. It made him the victim. It allowed him to keep his pride clean. "My mother was right about you," Nolan said. Mara felt something inside her crack, not loudly, quietly. Paige walked past her and picked up the cream scarf from Nolan's chair. Then she lifted Nolan's jacket from the back of another chair and slipped it over her shoulders, slow enough for Mara to see it clearly. It was a small act, but it said everything. Paige was not hiding. She was claiming space. "You can love a man," Paige said softly, "and still not be the woman who belongs beside him." Again, Nolan heard it. Again, he said nothing. Mara's fingers tightened around Grant's notebook. Her phone was still in her other hand because she had been recording Grant's medication notes earlier. Grant often forgot small timing details after evening medication, so Mara recorded his instructions with his permission and later wrote them neatly in his notebook. She had forgotten to stop the recording when she walked down the hallway. The screen was dark, but the recording was still running. She did not know yet that it had captured Paige's earlier whisper through the half-open door. "You promised she would be gone before the filing review." At that moment, Mara only knew her chest hurt. Her mind pulled her backward to the first year of marriage, when Nolan had stayed up before a meeting with Grant's advisors, terrified that his father would call him careless. Mara had sat beside him until sunrise. She corrected his numbers, cleaned up his slides, and helped him practice every answer. The next morning, Nolan had told Grant, "I handled it." Mara had smiled then. She had thought his confidence mattered more than credit. Now, standing in the study with Paige wearing his jacket and Ruth rewriting the truth, Mara finally understood. Her silence had not made Nolan stronger. It had taught him he could erase her and still benefit from her love. She looked at him. "Nolan, are you asking me to ignore what I just saw?" His face hardened. "I'm asking you to remember who gave you this life." June lowered her eyes near the doorway. Even Ruth went still for half a second, not because she felt sorry, but because Nolan had said the quiet part too clearly. Mara nodded once. She did not cry. She did not shout. She did not beg Paige to step away from her husband. She simply turned and walked out. The hallway felt longer than before. The rain sounded heavier against the windows. Behind her, Paige laughed under her breath, and Nolan did not tell her to stop. At the staircase, Mara gripped the railing to steady herself, then a weak hand caught her wrist. Grant stood on the lower landing, leaning heavily on his cane. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp and frightened. "Mara," he whispered, "did Paige mention the filing review?" Mara's blood went cold. She had not told him what she heard. She had not even understood it herself. Grant looked toward Nolan's closed study door. "If Nolan tries to remove you before morning," he said, "take whatever paper Cal gives you. Do not argue, do not explain, just leave with it." Mara stared at him. "Grant." "What is happening?" He swallowed, and for the first time since she had known him, the powerful old man looked afraid inside his own house. "The affair is not the secret that scares me," he said. Behind them, Nolan's study door clicked shut, and Mara knew morning would not bring peace. It would bring proof. "Pack whatever belongs to you. Nothing in this house does." Nolan's shout tore through the bedroom before Mara had even closed the door behind her. She stood frozen near the foot of the bed, still wearing the same dark dress from the charity dinner, her hair loose around her tired face. She had barely slept after what she saw in Nolan's study. Grant's warning still rang in her ears. Paige's hand on Nolan's wrist. Ruth's lie. Nolan's cold voice telling her to remember who gave her this life. Now morning had come with a heavy grey sky, and Nolan stood in the doorway with 2 security men behind him like he was removing a stranger from a hotel suite. Mara looked past him toward the hallway. Ruth stood there too, calm and dressed in pale silk, her hands folded like this was a family meeting and not the breaking of a marriage. "Nolan," Mara said quietly, "what is this?" "This is me finally seeing clearly," he snapped. "My mother told me everything." Mara's stomach tightened. Ruth stepped forward with a sad little sigh that sounded rehearsed. "She has been spying on estate matters," Ruth said. "She has been asking about documents she has no right to touch. Last night proved it. She wants access to this family's money." Mara looked at Nolan, waiting for him to think for himself, but pride had already made the decision for him. He believed Ruth because Ruth's lie made him feel powerful. It turned Mara's pain into a plot against him. It made him the important man being used by a small woman. Mara swallowed. "I went to your study because your father asked for you." Nolan laughed without warmth. "Don't use my father as your shield." "This is your father's house, Nolan," Mara said. The truth hit him harder than an insult. His face changed. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "Everything my father built is mine by blood. You are here by permission." Mara stared at him. For years she had watched him call himself self-made in front of guests, donors, and business friends. But this was the truth under the suit. He did not believe he earned the mansion. He believed he inherited the right to control anyone inside it. Behind him, one of the guards looked uncomfortable. Ruth did not. "Pack," Nolan said. "Now." Mara's phone buzzed on the nightstand. For 1 second, everyone heard it. Nolan glanced toward the screen, but Mara picked it up before he could see the message. It was from Leela Finch. "Final certificate released. Probate complete. You are now majority owner and managing chair of Hale Finch. Do not discuss client V19 with any Vale family member. Call me immediately when safe." Mara locked the phone. Her legal authority had arrived at the exact moment Nolan decided she had none. She moved slowly to the closet. She did not want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her panic. Her hands shook only once. When she reached for the sweater she wore the night Nolan proposed, she folded it, then stopped. The memory no longer felt safe. Before she could finish, Nolan grabbed the suitcase from the bed and began throwing clothes inside himself. "Nolan, stop," she said. He ignored her. He opened drawers, pulled out dresses, dropped shoes on top of folded papers, and shoved her life into a case like it was trash. A small folder slipped from the nightstand and landed near Mara's foot. Inside were copies of Grant's medication notes, property notices he had asked her to keep, and dates she had written down when Nolan ignored letters from the estate office. Mara bent and picked it up. She knew enough now not to leave any record behind. Outside, thunder rolled softly. Nolan dragged the suitcase down the stairs. Mara followed him through the front hall past June, who stood near the dining room with both hands pressed to her apron. June's eyes were wet, but she did not speak. Cal stood near the front doors, jaw tight, watching everything with the controlled stillness of a man who knew the cameras were recording. At the bottom of the stairs stood Brent Vale, 38, Nolan's cousin, and one of his most loyal family allies. Brent had always laughed at Nolan's cruel jokes before anyone else did. Now he leaned against the wall with a coffee cup in his hand, watching like Mara's humiliation was morning entertainment. The front doors opened. Cold air rushed in. The driveway waited under bruised sky. Black cars lined the stone curve. A few family guests from the night before still lingered near the entrance, pretending not to stare. Staff stood frozen along the edges of the hall, and beside Nolan's car stood Paige. She was under Nolan's umbrella. That sight hurt more than the suitcase. Paige wore a cream coat and looked untouched by the rain. Nolan had made sure his mistress stayed dry while his wife followed him into the cold. Nolan threw the suitcase onto the driveway. It burst open. Mara's clothes spilled across the wet stone. Her notebook slid out. Old photographs scattered. The folder of Grant's medication records opened, pages fluttering in the wind before Mara dropped to her knees to catch them. Nolan's voice cut across the driveway. "You are financially useless, Mara. You do not earn, you do not build, you just stand near people who do." The words struck so deeply that for a moment she could not breathe. Paige tilted her head, smiling. Some women confuse being tolerated with being chosen. Ruth stood on the front steps and added, "A woman with no family money should at least have humility." Nolan heard both of them. He did not defend his wife. He did not even look ashamed. Mara gathered the papers with careful hands. She could feel the mansion cameras above the driveway, small black eyes fixed beneath the stone arch. Cal saw them too. His face stayed blank, but his eyes shifted toward the camera, then back to Mara. The evidence was recording itself. Mara stood, holding the damp folder against her chest. "I protected you because I loved you," she said. Nolan laughed bitterly. "Protected me from what?" "You couldn't protect a checking account." The insult was meant to destroy her. Instead, it made something inside her go very quiet. She thought of Leela's message: probate complete, majority owner, managing chair, updated valuation, $240 million. She thought of Hale Finch, of her father's files, of the emergency review marked client V19. She could have said it then. She could have told him the truth. But Grant's warning stopped her. "Do not argue. Do not explain. Leave with the paper." Above them, behind an upstairs window, Grant watched with one hand braced against the glass. Beside him stood Elaine Price, 55, Grant's private nurse and daily medical aide. Grant's face was pale with fury. "Call Leela Finch," he told Elaine. "Tell her Nolan moved before the review." Elaine hesitated. "Sir?" Grant's voice sharpened. "Now." Down in the driveway, Mara slowly removed her wedding ring. For a moment, she held it in her palm. It looked too small to represent so much pain. Then she placed it on the hood of Nolan's car. "You wanted me out of the mansion," she said. "But one day you'll learn the mansion was never the powerful thing here." Nolan stared at her like she had lost her mind. Paige smiled wider. Ruth said, "Let her walk. Pride is all she has left." Mara picked up only what mattered: her folder, her notebook, her phone, her father's pen, and one old photograph that had fallen face down in the rain. Then she turned toward the gate. No one stopped her. As she passed Cal, he moved just enough for his shoulder to block the other's view. His hand brushed hers for less than a second. A folded paper slipped into her palm. Mara kept walking until she reached the edge of the gate. Only then did she look down. It was a copy of a tax notice Grant had authorized Cal to protect the night before. Across the top in bold letters were the words, "Potential penalties, $18,600,000 if unresolved. Below that was a client code, V19. Mara's breath caught. It was the same code from Leela's message. Behind her, the mansion doors closed, but the paper in her hand felt heavier than the house itself. And this time, Mara did not look back. The motel room door slammed behind Mara so hard the thin wall shook. For one wild second, she thought Nolan had followed her. She spun around, breath caught in her throat, one hand still gripping the damp folder against her chest. But there was no one there. Only the weak lock on the door. Only the sound of rain hitting the window. Only her own suitcase lying open on the faded carpet like another wound from the driveway. Mara stood still in the small room, soaked from the knees down, her hair clinging to her face. Her fingers stiff around the paper Cal had slipped into her hand. Potential penalties, $18,600,000 if unresolved. Client code V19, the same code from Leela's message. The same code tied to the company Mara now controlled. The room was nothing like the mansion. No marble floors, no gold-framed mirrors, no staff moving quietly in the background. Just one narrow bed, a dim lamp, a scratched wooden table, and a heater that clicked but barely warmed the air. Mara placed everything she had saved from the driveway onto the bed. Her father's old black pen, Grant's medication notebook, the folded tax notice, her wet wedding photo. The photo had landed face down in the rain, now the edges curled as it dried on a towel. Nolan's smiling face stared up at her from a better time, a time when she still believed love could make a proud man gentle. She did not cry at first. She only moved. She hung her wet dress over a chair. She spread the papers carefully so the ink would not run. She checked Grant's notebook page by page, making sure no dates were ruined. She wiped her father's pen with the corner of a towel. Then she saw the wedding ring mark on her finger, the empty pale circle where the ring had been. That was when she broke. Mara sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands over her mouth, but the pain came through anyway. She did not cry because she lost the mansion. She did not want Grant Vale's polished floors or Ruth's cold approval or Paige's stolen place under Nolan's umbrella. She cried because she had loved Nolan enough to protect him from embarrassment while he was preparing to erase her. Memory after memory rose and hurt her all over again. The night before Nolan's investor meeting, when he panicked because his numbers did not match. Mara had stayed awake until sunrise fixing his slides. The afternoon he forgot to pay a vendor before a public event, and Mara quietly paid part of the late invoice from her own savings so Nolan would not look careless. The emails he was too proud to write, apologies she drafted so he could send them under his own name. The property letters he ignored because they looked boring. The medication schedule for Grant that Nolan called staff work, even though Grant's health affected every estate decision Nolan wanted to control. She had not done those things because she was weak. She had done them because she loved him. But love, she now understood, had become the place where Nolan hid his failures. Her father's voice returned in memory. Thomas had once stood beside her in the Hale Finch office after a client shouted over a missing document he had refused to provide. Mara had been young then, angry on her father's behalf. Thomas only closed the file and told her, "Do not confuse loyalty with becoming someone's hiding place." At the time, Mara thought he meant business. Now she knew he meant life. Her phone vibrated. Mara flinched. A message from June appeared. "I am sorry, I could not stop them. Please keep the folder safe. Mr. Grant asked for you after they closed the doors." Mara closed her eyes. Grant had seen. That hurt too. A knock came at the door. Mara went still again. Then Leela's voice came from the other side. "Mara, it's me." Mara opened the door. Leela stepped inside carrying a leather document bag, her coat dark with rain. She took one look at Mara's face, then at the papers spread across the bed, and her expression changed from concern to professional focus. "You kept the notice," Leela said. "Cal gave it to me," Mara answered. Her voice sounded strange, almost empty. "Grant told me he might." "That was smart of him." Mara looked at her. "What is V19? Leela did not answer right away. She set her bag on the table, opened it, and pulled out a sealed folder. "Before I tell you, you need to understand your position," she said. "Probate is finalized. You are now the majority owner and managing chair of Hale Finch Estate Management. Current valuation is $240 million. Mara looked toward the wet suitcase on the floor. Only hours ago, Nolan had called her financially useless in front of his mistress, his mother, his cousins, staff, and guests. Now Leela was saying Mara controlled a company worth more than Nolan had ever personally earned. But Mara did not feel powerful. She felt responsible. Leela continued, "Your father left you ownership, but he also left you duty. We cannot use client files for revenge. We cannot leak private records. We cannot act out of anger. Mara nodded slowly. But, Leela said, if a client file shows fraud, false filings, unauthorized requests, or estate risk, we are required to act, especially now that Grant directly authorized emergency contact. Mara looked at the tax notice again. Then we do this clean, she said. Leela's eyes softened for the first time. That is exactly what your father would have wanted. She opened the sealed folder and showed Mara a list of coded compliance reviews from years earlier. Mara recognized her own initials beside several entries. MH review. Her mouth went dry. These were mine, Mara said. Yes, Leela replied. You reviewed late property schedules, mismatched expense categories, and missing filing notes while helping your father. You were never shown the client name because Hale Finch separated client identity from junior review work. Mara touched the paper. V19 was Grant's estate. Leela nodded. The room seemed to fall silent around that truth. While Nolan mocked her, while Ruth called her a woman with no family money, while Paige stood under Nolan's umbrella, Mara had already helped protect the Vale properties from penalties. She had been guarding the mansion long before she knew whose mansion it was. Mara reached for her phone. I have audio from last night, she said. I was recording Grant's medication notes before I walked past the study. It caught Paige saying Nolan promised I'd be gone before the filing review. Leela's expression sharpened. Mara continued, placing items one by one on the bed. The driveway cameras recorded the expulsion. Cal showed me where the outside camera points. This notice says $18.6 million in possible penalties. My notebook shows dates Nolan ignored estate letters. Grant's medication records show he was clear on days Nolan may claim he was confused. Leela listened without interrupting. This was no longer only heartbreak. It was a trail, a clean one. A documented one. Leela finally asked Mara, do you want to destroy him? Mara looked at the wedding photo drying on the towel. Nolan's old smile looked almost innocent now, but she knew better. Paige's voice still echoed. Ruth's lies still burned. Nolan's shout still lived in her bones. She wiped her face. No, she said. I want the truth to stop protecting him. Leela nodded once, then opened her laptop on the scratched table. The screen glowed in the dark room. She entered a secure password, then pulled up the Hale Finch client system. Mara watched as Leela typed the code. V19. The client header appeared. Grant Vale Luxury Estate Holdings. Under it, one red alert flashed across the screen. Unauthorized filing request submitted under Nolan Vale's credentials. Mara leaned closer, and for the first time that night, her tears stopped completely. Somewhere inside that file, Nolan had left a door open. And by morning, Mara would know what he had tried to move through it. The archive room alarm flashed red before Mara even touched the door. Leela entered the code twice, but the warning stayed on the small screen beside the handle. A hard mechanical beep echoed through the quiet Hale Finch hallway, sharp enough to make Mara's stomach tighten. Someone had tried to access client V19 before sunrise. Mara stood beside Leela with her father's pen in her coat pocket and the damp tax notice folded inside her bag. She had barely slept after seeing Nolan's unauthorized filing request on Leela's laptop. Now, standing in front of the locked archive, she understood that the danger was not waiting somewhere in the future. It had already reached the file. Leela's face hardened. That confirms it. Someone outside approved channels tried to pull the record. Could it be Nolan? Mara asked. It was requested through credentials connected to Nolan, Leela said, but that does not prove he acted alone. That is why we document first and accuse later. The lock finally clicked. Inside, the archive room was cold, narrow, and lined with metal shelves. File boxes sat in perfect rows. Red tabs marked urgent reviews. A scanner hummed softly in the corner like the room itself was breathing. At the center table stood Owen Reed, 42, a forensic tax analyst at Hale Finch and one of Thomas Hale's most trusted former employees. He wore wireframe glasses and held a thick folder against his chest like it was something alive. His eyes moved to Mara. Your father said, if this file ever turned red, we should call you. Mara stepped closer. Why me? Owen placed the folder on the table. Because you caught the first pattern years ago. The words slowed the room. Mara looked down at the label. V19/Grant Vale Luxury Estate Holdings/urgent review. Her husband's father, his mansion, his luxury properties, the same family that had thrown her into the rain and called her useless. Leela pulled out a chair for Mara, but Mara did not sit yet. She stared at the file like it might speak before they opened it. Owen carefully lifted the cover. The first pages showed property schedules. The numbers were large enough to feel unreal. Main mansion estate, $42 million appraised value. Coastal luxury property, $31 million. Private mountain retreat, $27 million. 2 rental estate holdings, $39 million combined. Total property exposure, $139 million. Mara swallowed. Nolan had walked through those estates like they were proof of his greatness. He had stood at charity dinners and said he built the family reputation, but the paper in front of her showed the truth. He had inherited access to a kingdom he did not understand. Owen turned several pages. These were the penalty risks, he said. Late records, misclassified expenses, missing property schedules, incorrect reporting paths. Leela pointed to a column near the bottom. For several years, Hellfinch prevented approximately $18.6 million in penalties, interest, and forced restructuring exposure. Mara's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. Then Owen slid one page toward her. Several notes were marked under coded review line. MH Review. Mara stared at her own initials. For a moment, the archive room disappeared. She was younger again, sitting in her father's office with coffee gone cold beside her and boxes stacked around her feet. Thomas had given her coded files and told her never to ask for names she was not cleared to know. She had checked dates, matched schedules, corrected categories, and marked inconsistencies because that was what he taught her to do. She had not known one of those files belonged to Grant Vale. She had not known she was protecting Nolan's family before she even married into it. I was protecting them, she whispered. Leela's voice softened. Yes, before they even knew your name was on the work. Mara closed her eyes for 1 second. Nolan's voice came back. You are financially useless. The words no longer sounded powerful. They sounded ignorant. Owen turned to the recent section of the file. This is where it changes. He placed several invoices on the table. Nolan had approved image consulting payments totaling $740,000. The payments did not go to one company. They went to 3. Win Image Advisory, PW Lifestyle Concepts, Cream Room Strategy. Mara's eyes stopped on the last name. Cream, the cream scarf in Nolan's study, the cream coat in the driveway, Page under Nolan's umbrella while Mara's clothes lay in the rain. Owen continued. Some invoices were labeled as estate branding, event positioning, and public reputation strategy, but the attached receipts show personal gifts, wardrobe purchases, and luxury travel. Leela slid another document forward. Page was not only involved with Nolan. She was being paid through estate-linked accounts. Mara did not speak. If she spoke too soon, pain would come out before truth. Owen pulled another stack from the folder. There is more. The next document was worse. It was a draft request naming Nolan as temporary estate decision-maker if Grant was declared mentally unfit. Attached to it was a medical statement from a doctor Mara did not recognize. The date on the statement made her heart jump. That day, Mara said, reaching into her bag. Grant was clear that day. She pulled out the medication notebook and opened it to the matching date. Her handwriting filled the page. Grant had reviewed a property letter, asked for Nolan, corrected a staff payment issue, and signed a routine care document. Mara had written his exact words because Grant had asked her to keep a practical record after his medication changes. Leela looked at the notebook, then at the medical statement. This helps show the incapacity claim may have been staged or at least improperly supported. Owen's voice lowered. And Ruth knew there was a plan to keep you away. He opened an email printout. Mara must not be near the filing review. Another email underneath it read, once Grant is declared incapable, the estate will finally move properly. Mara felt cold all over. Ruth had not simply disliked her. Ruth had not simply insulted her because of class or pride. Ruth had been helping clear the path. Mara remembered Ruth standing on the front steps, saying a woman with no family money should have humility. Now Ruth's own words sat in the file like fingerprints. A memory of Thomas returned, quiet and heavy. A dishonest family always leaves 2 records, he had told her once. The record they show and the record they fear. Now Mara understood why her father marked dangerous files in red. Leela placed a formal document in front of her. As managing chair, you have authority to place this file under compliance hold. That means no release, no filing change, no access modification, and no estate action tied to this file without verified authority from Grant or the board. Mara read the document carefully, not as a rejected wife, not as a humiliated woman. As the owner of the company responsible for the truth, she signed. The first act of revenge was not loud. It was ink. Leela listed the actions as Mara approved them. Freeze release of V19. Require Grant's direct consent for any filing. Flag page-linked invoices for forensic review. Notify estate council of possible unauthorized activity. Preserve all recordings, camera footage, emails, and medical notes. Prepare referral materials for a financial and tax investigation. Mara did not call Nolan. She did not threaten Ruth. She did not expose Paige online. She simply stopped the lie from moving forward. When she finished signing, Owen reached into the back of the file box and paused. There's a sealed folder here. He lifted it carefully. Across the front was Thomas Hale's handwriting. If Nolan tries to remove Mara, open this before releasing anything. Mara's breath caught. Leela looked from the folder to Mara, her face pale with understanding. Your father knew this day might come. Mara touched the seal, and the archive room seemed to hold its breath. Outside the room, the lobby phone began ringing. Once, twice. Then the receptionist's voice came through the intercom, tense and careful. Ms. Finch, Nolan Vale is here. He is demanding access to client V19. Mara looked at the sealed folder in her hand. For years, she had hidden her strength to protect Nolan's pride. Now Nolan had walked straight into the place where her silence ended. You had one night outside my family, and now you think you can hold our documents hostage. Nolan's voice exploded through the Hale Finch lobby before the receptionist could even stand. Mara sat inside the glass conference room, her hands folded on the plain wooden table. The room had no chandeliers, no marble staircase, no portraits of powerful men staring down from gold frames. It had clean glass walls, grey chairs, a locked file case beside Leela, and the quiet weight of authority. That quiet seemed to make Nolan angrier. He stormed in with Ruth beside him, Paige close behind, and Brent following like he had come to enjoy another public humiliation. Behind them walked Marcus Bell, 39, Hale Finch's office security supervisor, and the employee responsible for protecting client records inside the building. Marcus did not block them yet, because the lobby was public, but he stayed close enough to remind everyone this was not the Vale mansion. Nolan pointed at Mara through the glass. She doesn't have the right to stop anything. Leela Finch, 51, executive counsel for Hale Finch Estate Management, and the woman responsible for protecting the company's legal chain of custody, stood near the locked file case, calm and sharp. They are not your documents, Mr. Vale, Leela said. They are client records managed under fiduciary duty. Nolan laughed and looked around, as if he expected the whole office to laugh with him. She doesn't even know what fiduciary means. Mara said nothing. That silence irritated him more than any answer could have. Only 1 hour earlier, Mara had stood in the archive room with Thomas Hale's sealed folder in her hands. She had wanted to open it immediately, but Leela had stopped her. Not like that, Leela had said. We logged the seal, scan the exterior, record who is present, and open it on camera. If Thomas left evidence, we make sure no one can claim you planted it. So Mara had waited. Now Nolan had walked into her office, still believing she was the same woman he threw into the rain. Ruth stepped forward, her face arranged into soft concern. Mara is emotional and vindictive, Ruth said. She is using her failed marriage to interfere with estate matters. Nolan nodded instantly, like Ruth had given him the line he wanted to believe. My mother warned me you would try something desperate, he said. Mara opened her notebook. She wrote the time. Then she wrote his sentence word for word. Nolan's expression changed. What are you doing? Documenting, Mara said softly. The word made the room feel colder. For years, Nolan had mocked her notes. He had called them unnecessary. He had rolled his eyes when she saved receipts, corrected dates, backed up emails, and wrote down who said what during estate calls. Now, for the first time, he looked at her notebook like it might be more dangerous than shouting. Paige moved to the conference table and placed her designer bag on it with a small, careless sound. The bag was cream-colored with gold hardware, perfectly polished, perfectly placed, as if she was marking territory again. Mara, this is embarrassing, Paige said. You were thrown out of the family. Stop reaching for power you never had. Mara looked at the bag. She had seen it before, not in Paige's hand, but in the V19 file. Same brand, same color. Same vendor description hidden under image consulting expenses. Mara lifted her eyes. That bag has an invoice number. Paige's smile flickered. It was small, but Mara saw it. So did Leela. Nolan looked between them. What is that supposed to mean? Leela answered before Mara could. It means everyone in this room should be careful about what was personal, what was business, and what was charged through an estate-linked account. Paige pulled the bag closer to her body. Behind the glass wall, Owen Reed, 42, forensic tax analyst at Hale Finch and one of Thomas Hale's most trusted former employees, was working at a scanner. Page after page moved through the machine. Grant signed notices, Paige linked invoices, Ruth's emails, copies of medical notes. The driveway camera request Cal had delivered earlier. The real fight was happening quietly, line by line, while Nolan wasted his strength trying to look powerful. Mara watched him, and for one painful second, she saw the man she used to love. Not the shouting man in front of her, but the younger Nolan who once sat beside her at midnight, afraid Grant would call him careless. She had fixed his presentation that night. She had adjusted his numbers. She had told him where to pause, where to sound confident, where to act like he understood the work. The next day he told Grant, "I handled it." Mara had let him. Love had made her generous then. Love had made her quiet. Love had made her believe that helping a man rise was different from letting him stand on her shoulders. Now she knew the difference. Nolan leaned over the table. "I built this family's modern reputation," he said. "My father's old advisors are scared of me because I don't need them." Mara looked at him gently. "You needed them every time a deadline came." His face darkened. He slammed his palm on the table. The sound cracked through the conference room. Marcus stepped closer. Leela raised one hand slightly, telling him to wait. Nolan glared at Mara. "Do not talk to me like you made me." Mara's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "I never wanted to make you, Nolan. I wanted to help you become the man you pretended to be." For the first time, Nolan had no quick answer. Ruth filled the silence. "You see," she said, "this is exactly what I meant. She has always thought she was above this family." Mara turned to Ruth. "No," she said, "I thought I was part of it." The words landed quietly, but even Brent stopped smirking. Leela opened her laptop. "Since everyone is here, we should clarify why the file was placed under compliance hold." Nolan straightened. "You have nothing." Leela clicked once. Paige's voice filled the room from Mara's phone recording. "You promised she would be gone before the filing review." The conference room shifted. Paige went still. Ruth's mouth tightened. Nolan's eyes darted toward Paige, then back to Mara. "That proves nothing," he said too quickly. Mara closed her notebook. "Then you won't mind explaining it at the estate meeting." Nolan scoffed, but his confidence had changed shape. It was thinner now, forced. "What estate meeting?" Before Mara answered, Leela's tablet chimed. She read the email, then slowly slid the screen across the table toward Mara. Grant Vale had signed an emergency authorization. Mara Hale Vale is authorized to present the V19 compliance hold and supporting records at the emergency estate review. All access changes involving Grant Vale luxury estate holdings are frozen until review. Nolan saw his father's signature. For the first time since entering the office, he went pale. Ruth reached for the tablet, but Leela moved it back. "This is not a family argument anymore," Leela said. "This is a protected client matter." Nolan stared at Mara. "You went to my father behind my back." Mara shook her head. "No, your father came to the records before you could bury them." Owen stepped into the conference room holding the sealed folder from Thomas Hale. Its exterior had now been scanned, logged, and photographed. The handwriting on the front looked steady and old. "If Nolan tries to remove Mara, open this before releasing anything." Nolan's face changed. He recognized the name Thomas Hale. He had heard Grant mention Thomas before, but always with a respect that annoyed him. Leela broke the seal on camera. Inside was not a dramatic confession. It was worse because it was practical. A memo, a timeline, a list of prior estate risks connected to Nolan's decisions. A note from Thomas explaining that client V19 had once required extra safeguards because Grant's son repeatedly tried to rush filings, reclassify personal expenses, and pressure advisors to approve changes before records were complete. At the bottom, Thomas had written, "If my daughter is ever pulled into the Vale family by marriage, and this same pattern returns, treat her as a protected witness, not a spouse to be dismissed." Mara's throat tightened. Her father had not predicted every detail. He had simply recognized a pattern. Nolan looked at the memo as if it had betrayed him. Ruth whispered, "That man had no right." Leela closed the folder. "That man saved your estate once," she said. "Now his daughter may have to do it again." No one spoke. Then Marcus opened the conference room door. "Ms. Finch," he said carefully, "Grant Vale's driver has arrived. The estate board is already gathering at the mansion." Leela locked the file case. Mara rose slowly. Nolan stepped back as if he had only just realized the room belonged to her. For years, Mara had followed him through doors. This time, Nolan watched her walk out first, and the locked file case went with her. "Keep the cameras rolling." Nolan's voice cut through the mansion dining hall like a command, sharp enough to make two servers freeze beside the dessert table. The emergency estate review had been arranged at the mansion because Grant's doctor did not want him traveling twice in one day. But before the formal meeting could begin, Nolan had turned the waiting period into a performance. White flowers lined the long table. Crystal glasses caught the afternoon light. A small family-approved media team stood near the wall, ready to capture Nolan looking calm, strong, and wronged. He wanted the room to see him as the victim before Mara could reveal anything else. Paige stood beside him in cream again, her hand resting near his arm like she belonged there. Ruth sat near the center of the table, smiling with the calm pride of a woman who believed presentation could bury truth. Brent leaned near a window, already amused. At the head of the room sat Grant. His body looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. Cal stood close to the door, watching every movement. Nolan adjusted his cufflinks and faced the guests. Some were estate board members. Some were donors from the charity dinner who had not yet left the estate grounds. Some were old family friends who had always treated the Vale name like it was made of gold. Among them was Vera Sloan, 62, chairwoman of the Vale Estate Board and a longtime advisor to Grant. Vera had a reputation for reading contracts more carefully than people read faces. She watched Nolan with a serious expression, not applauding yet. Nolan smiled for the cameras. Some people, he said, loud enough for everyone, cannot handle being removed from privilege. A few guests shifted in their chairs. Everyone knew he meant Mara. Nolan continued, "My family has been forced to deal with emotional interference from someone who forgot the difference between marriage and ownership." Ruth lowered her eyes as if deeply hurt. Paige placed a soft hand on Nolan's sleeve. It was perfect theater. Then the doors opened. Mara walked in. The room went silent so quickly that even the cameras seemed too loud. She was not dressed like a woman begging to return. She wore a simple dark suit, her hair pulled back, her face calm. Leela walked beside her with a leather folder. Owen followed with a locked file case. Marcus stayed near the rear entrance because Hale Finch records had to remain under company custody until the review formally began. Nolan's smile stayed in place, but his jaw tightened. "Security," he said, still trying to perform for the room. "This is a private family event." Grant spoke before anyone moved. "No." The word was quiet, but it had more power than Nolan's shouting. Everyone turned toward him. Grant lifted his eyes to Nolan. "This is an estate review," he said. "She belongs here more than you do." The room changed, not loudly, not all at once, but Mara felt it. The guests looked from Grant to Nolan, then from Nolan to Paige. The story Nolan had prepared began to crack before he could finish telling it. Ruth's smile faded for half a second. Paige's fingers slipped away from Nolan's sleeve. Nolan looked at his father like he had been slapped. "This is my family," he said. "My name is Vale." Grant leaned forward slightly. "And that name is exactly what you put at risk." No one spoke. Mara stood near the doorway, feeling the weight of that sentence. Only one day earlier, she had walked out of the mansion with her suitcase wet and open on the driveway. Now she had returned with legal authority, not emotion. She did not need to raise her voice. That alone made Nolan look smaller. Leela stepped forward. "Before this continues," she said, "all non-authorized guests and media staff must leave. This meeting involves confidential estate records, client files, medical capacity notes, and possible compliance issues." Nolan snapped, "You don't give orders in this house." Vera finally spoke. "In an estate review she is correct." That made Nolan's face flush. The media team hesitated. Ruth gave a stiff nod and they began packing their equipment. Several donors stood awkwardly, pretending not to understand what they had just witnessed. But the damage was already done. They had seen Mara enter with authority. They had seen Grant defend her. They had seen Nolan lose control in his own staged performance. Public exposure had begun, even without one private document being read aloud. Paige tried to stay seated. Leela looked at her. "Ms. Wynne, this portion is restricted." Paige lifted her chin. "I'm part of Nolan's executive image team." Leela's voice remained calm. "Then you are a vendor under review, not family counsel." Owen placed a sealed vendor packet on the table. The tab was visible for only a second. "Wynne Image Advisory." Paige saw it. Her face changed. For the first time, her cream dress did not look like power. It looked like evidence. Vera looked at Paige. "You may remain nearby until the vendor payment section. Until then, you wait outside with counsel or a board representative." Paige looked at Nolan. Nolan did not defend her. He was too busy watching the file case. Mara saw the moment Paige understood what Mara had understood in the driveway. Nolan protected only what protected Nolan. Paige left the room with stiff steps. As the doors closed behind her, Nolan turned on Mara. "You planned this," he said. Mara answered quietly, "No, you did. I documented it." Brent's smirk disappeared. Ruth leaned forward. Grant, this is shameful. She is manipulating you. Grant turned his head slowly toward his wife. She took better care of my records than the people who shared my name. Ruth went still. Grant looked around the table, his voice low but clear. Years ago, Thomas Hale saved this estate when Nolan made reckless decisions with credit lines and property expenses. Thomas separated my son from direct filing control before damage became disaster. Nolan stood. Dad, stop. Grant raised one hand. Nolan stopped, but his face burned with anger. You have called yourself self-made for years, Grant said, but every time you fell, someone quiet cleaned the floor before guests arrived. Mara looked down. She knew Grant was not only talking about Thomas, he was talking about her too. The late-night presentations, the corrected numbers, the apologies she drafted, the letters she flagged, the deadlines she saved. Every silent act of love had become invisible labor for a man who later called her useless. For the first time, that truth did not only hurt, it steadied her. Leela moved to the center of the table and set down the locked file case. Owen placed Thomas Hale's sealed memo packet beside it. Cal closed the doors after the last unauthorized guest left. The click of the door sounded final. Grant looked at Leela. Begin. Leela opened the locked file case. Mara glanced across the table and saw Nolan gripping the arms of his chair. Paige was no longer beside him. Ruth was no longer smiling. Brent was no longer entertained. Owen opened the first folder and looked around the room. Before we begin, he said, everyone should know the penalties avoided by Hale Finch total $18.6 million. Ruth's voice came out barely above a whisper. Avoided by who? Mara finally looked up, and inside the open file her initials were waiting. Avoided by who? Ruth's whisper cut through the room like a crack in glass. No one moved. The mansion estate review room had gone so still that Mara could hear the soft scrape of paper as Owen opened the first folder. Heavy curtains blocked most of the afternoon light. The long polished table reflected every nervous face around it. Only minutes earlier, Nolan had tried to control the room with cameras, guests, and reputation. Now the cameras were gone. The doors were closed. And the only thing left in front of him was the file he had tried to keep hidden. Leela stood beside the open file case. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. That made the moment worse for Nolan because there was no emotion for him to attack. For the record, Leela said, as of this morning, Mara Hale Vale is the managing chair and majority owner of Hale Finch Estate Management. Current company valuation, $240 million. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Nolan blinked like the words had reached him in the wrong language. Ruth's hand moved to the pearls at her throat, gripping them so tightly her knuckles whitened. Brent looked from Mara to Nolan, then down at the table, suddenly less eager to be entertained. Mara said nothing. That was the first victory. She did not need to explain herself. The truth had entered the room with its own weight. Nolan finally forced out a laugh. That is impossible. Leela looked at him. It is certified. Owen slid a document across the table. Vera and the other estate board members leaned forward to read the proof. Nolan did not touch it. He kept staring at Mara, as if the woman he threw into the rain had been replaced by someone he did not recognize. But Mara had not changed. That was what hurt the most. She had always been this woman. He had simply never cared enough to see her. Owen turned to the first section of the V19 file. Several years, he said, Grant Vale Luxury Estate Holdings had repeated filing risks, late property records, incomplete schedules, misclassified expenses, and missing support documents. Hale Finch corrected those issues before they became penalties. He placed copies of the corrections on the table. Some early reviews were completed under coded assignments. The reviewer did not know the client name because Hale Finch separates client identity from certain internal compliance checks. He tapped the initials near the bottom, MH Review. Ruth stared at the letters. Mara remembered those nights in her father's office. She had been young, tired, and careful, matching property schedules to tax forms, while Thomas reminded her never to guess when records could prove. She had thought she was helping a faceless client. She had been helping Grant. She had been helping Nolan. Owen continued, without those corrections, the estate could have faced approximately $18.6 million in penalties, interest, and forced restructuring exposure. Grant looked at Mara. His eyes were full of pain and something deeper than gratitude. Shame, maybe. Shame that the woman who had protected his family had been left standing in the rain. Nolan looked sick. The words from the driveway returned without anyone saying them. Financially useless. Now they sounded absurd. Leela opened the next folder. This section concerns vendor payments. Vera pressed her pen against her notebook. Bring Ms. Wynne back for this portion, she said. Cal opened the door and motioned to the hallway. Paige returned with her chin high, but her confidence was thin now. A board aide stood behind her to witness the vendor discussion. Leela placed 3 vendor summaries side by side. Payments totaling $740,000 were approved for image consulting, lifestyle branding, and event strategy. The vendors were Wynne Image Advisory, PW Lifestyle Concepts, and Cream Room Strategy. Paige's face lost color. Owen placed an invoice beside a still image from the driveway footage. The image was cruel in its stillness. Mara's suitcase open on the wet stone, Paige standing dry beneath Nolan's umbrella, wearing the cream coat. The coat appears on one of the vendor receipts, Leela said, along with travel, wardrobe purchases, and personal luxury items later categorized as estate-related branding. Nolan turned toward Paige. Paige's voice came out small. Nolan approved those. The alliance cracked in front of everyone. Nolan's eyes hardened. You told me those could be categorized. You signed them, Paige snapped back, forgetting the room for one dangerous second. That one sentence did more damage than Mara ever could have done by shouting. Vera wrote something down. Paige saw the pen move and went silent. Leela moved to the next packet. This section involves communication around the filing review. Ruth's face tightened before the first page was even read. Owen placed 2 email printouts on the table. The first read, Mara must not be near the filing review. The second read, once Grant is declared incapable, the estate will finally move properly. Grant slowly turned toward Ruth. For the first time since Mara had known her, Ruth had no graceful expression ready. Mara opened her medication notebook and slid it to Leela. The pages were dated, neat, and steady. Grant's medication times, his conversations, his questions about property notices, his signature reminders. His clear decisions on the same day. Certain documents implied he was confused. Leela said, these notes do not replace medical records, but they support a timeline showing Grant was functioning clearly on key dates when other paperwork suggested otherwise. Grant's voice was low. My daughter-in-law kept better records of my condition than my own wife. Ruth looked down. No defense came. Nolan stood too quickly. This is a misunderstanding. But his voice cracked on the last word. Leela turned another document toward the board. Then the investigation will give you a chance to explain every signature, every access request, and every reclassified expense. There it was, not instant destruction, not wild revenge, a clean road toward consequences, unauthorized release requests, questionable expense classifications, page-linked invoices, Ruth's emails, medical conflict, driveway footage, audio from the study, a pattern, not a rumor. Mara finally looked at Nolan. She had imagined this moment might feel like satisfaction. It did not. It felt like standing at the grave of the life she thought she had. You threw me out of your father's driveway, she said quietly, and called me financially useless. But the truth is, the properties you bragged about stayed protected because of the company I inherited, the records I corrected, and the evidence you were too proud to read. No one spoke. The whole family was silent. Nolan's mouth moved once, but nothing came out. Ruth stared at the table. Paige lowered her eyes. Brent stopped pretending he was separate from the shame. Grant placed both hands on the table and pushed himself upright. Until the investigation is complete, he said, you are removed from all estate access, all filing authority, and all spending approvals tied to my holdings. Nolan's chair scraped back. You can't do that. I'm your son. Grant looked at him with a sadness that felt final. That is the only reason I did not do it sooner. Outside the closed doors, Cal's radio clicked once. A quiet voice reported from the hallway. Mr. Vale's private office just went into manual lock. Someone used an internal code. Nolan's face turned pale. Mara saw it. So did Grant. So did Vera. And suddenly everyone understood the file had not finished speaking. Mr. Vale's private office just went into manual lock. Someone used an internal code. Cal's radio went silent, and every face in the estate review room changed. Nolan moved first. He shoved his chair back so hard it struck the wall behind him. That is my private office. Grant's eyes narrowed. Not anymore. Nolan ignored him and rushed toward the doors, but Cal stepped in front of him. For 1 second, Nolan looked like he might push past him. Then he saw the estate board members watching. He saw Leela holding the file. He saw Mara standing perfectly still. Old Nolan would have shouted until someone moved. This Nolan had just lost the room. Cal spoke calmly into his radio. Do not open the office without board counsel present. Preserve the door camera and access log. Nolan's face went pale. That was when Mara knew there was something in that office he did not want anyone to see. Within hours, the mansion changed from a house of wealth into a house of consequences. The same staff who once moved silently around Nolan now avoided his eyes. The same board members who had once smiled at his speeches now asked for passwords, account records, vendor approvals, and signed authorizations. By evening, the first formal restrictions were in place. Nolan's estate spending access was frozen. His corporate cards tied to Grant's holdings stopped working. His pending property decisions were removed from the board agenda. The family office locked him out of accounts he had always treated like personal money. Nolan stood in the hallway staring at his phone as one notification after another appeared. Transaction declined. Account access suspended. Board approval required. Authority under review. For years, he had walked around saying he was self-made. Now the records showed what Mara had always known. His projects had been supported by Grant's estate credit, staff labor, Hale Finch corrections, and quiet people cleaning up problems before anyone noticed. His image did not collapse all at once. It cracked in pieces. The locked office was opened later that night with Grant's counsel, Vera, Cal, and Denise Rowe present. Denise Rowe, 48, a financial compliance investigator hired by the estate board to review suspicious payments and unauthorized filings, arrived with a small team and a sealed evidence kit. She did not look impressed by the mansion. She did not look frightened by the Vale name. She looked at the documents, the signatures, the invoices, the access logs, and the timelines. That frightened Nolan more than anger would have. The office did not contain one dramatic confession. It contained something more realistic and more damaging. Draft letters, unsent filing instructions, printed emails with notes in Ruth's handwriting, a folder of Page's invoices with revised descriptions, a list of board members Nolan believed he could pressure, and a half-written statement accusing Mara of using marriage to gain access to estate secrets. The statement had been created before Mara was thrown into the driveway. That detail changed everything. It proved the humiliation had not been a sudden emotional outburst. It had been part of a plan. Mara did not watch the office search from inside the mansion. She returned to Hale Finch with Leela because her company could not appear to be raiding a client's family home. Everything had to stay clean. Everything had to pass through counsel, board authority, and documented custody. That was how truth survived powerful people. The next morning, Mara sat across from Leela while Owen organized scanned records into a secure investigation folder. The room smelled of coffee and paper. It was plain, quiet, and honest. After the mansion's gold lights and polished cruelty, the office felt like ground under her feet. Her phone kept lighting up. "Nolan, we need to talk." "Nolan again, you misunderstood." Then Page meant nothing. Then "my mother pushed me." Mara read none of them twice. She turned the phone face down. "All communication goes through you," she told Leela. Leela nodded. "That is the safest way." It was more than safe. It was necessary. Mara knew herself. If she heard Nolan's voice too soon, some soft, wounded part of her might remember the man she used to love. The man who once held her hand in her father's office and promised he would never make her feel small. The man who slowly became proud enough to accept her help and cruel enough to deny she had ever given it. Private softness had protected him for too long. Now only records would speak. Across town, Page's world was also falling apart. Denise contacted her about the invoices tied to Win Image Advisory, PW Lifestyle Concepts, and Cream Room Strategy. Page tried to sound innocent. She said Nolan approved everything. She said she only followed instructions. She said the purchases were part of public image work. But Owen found changes in the invoice descriptions. The first drafts had personal notes, wardrobe, travel, private gifts, a cream coat. The later versions called them brand alignment, estate positioning, and donor-facing presentation. The edits had been made after Ruth warned Nolan that Mara should not be near the filing review. Page's clients did not vanish in 1 hour, but the calls slowed by the end of the week. Wealthy families might enjoy gossip, but they did not trust an image consultant whose name appeared in an estate misuse review. Her social invitations disappeared first. Then 2 retainers paused. Then 1 client asked for every invoice she had ever submitted. The cream coat, the designer bag, and several luxury items were returned through Leela's office in sealed boxes. Mara did not meet Page. She did not need to. Page had wanted Mara to feel replaced. Now Page was being reduced to invoice numbers and returned property tags. Ruth fell more quietly, but not less completely. Her lunch invitations stopped. Her charity committee asked her to step back until the estate matter became clearer. Grant removed her from estate decision discussions. The board requested every email she had sent about Grant's health, Nolan's authority, and Mara's access to records. Ruth tried one final lie. She manipulated Grant, Ruth said during a board interview. Mara made him distrust his own family. But Cal provided footage from the mansion hallways. The videos showed Mara bringing Grant medicine, helping him review letters, calling for his nurse, and sitting with him during long evenings when Ruth was absent. Other footage showed Grant pressing the call button while Ruth ignored it during a private gathering downstairs. Ruth's lie died without drama. That was the strange thing about truth. It did not always need to shout. Sometimes it only needed to be played back. Brent tried to step away from Nolan after that. He told board counsel he had only been present as family support, but the access logs showed his temporary card had been used near Nolan's office twice during the same period when revised invoice summaries were printed. Brent did not go to prison in a day. No one did, but his laughter ended immediately. His board privileges were suspended. His access to the mansion's private office wing was removed. His name was added to Denise's interview list. That was enough to make him understand something Mara had learned in the rain. Humiliation feels different when everyone is watching. Later that week, Grant asked to see Mara at Hale Finch. He arrived with Cal and Elaine Price, 55, his private nurse and daily medical aide. He moved slowly, but his mind was clear. Mara met him in the small conference room, the same room where Nolan had mocked her for not knowing what fiduciary meant. Grant looked older than he had days ago. "I saw how much you carried," he said. "I should have spoken sooner." Mara's throat tightened. For a moment she was back in the driveway, clothes wet on the stone, waiting for someone in that family to say she mattered. "You trusted me when they didn't," she said. "That mattered." Grant bowed his head. Mara did not celebrate anyone's downfall after that. She worked. She stabilized the V19 file. She helped protect the estate from further damage. She prepared her divorce filing. And inside Hale Finch, she created a new ethics rule in her father's honor. No family pressure overrides client protection. That rule became the first decision she made, not as Nolan's wife, not as Grant's daughter-in-law, but as the leader Thomas Hale had prepared her to be. 2 days later, as rain began again outside the Hale Finch windows, Marcus walked into Mara's office. His expression was tense. "Nolan is here," he said. "No appointment." Mara looked through the glass doors. Nolan stood in the lobby. For the first time since she had known him, there was no luxury watch on his wrist. He saw her and stepped closer to the glass. "Mara, please," he said. "I lost everything." Mara looked at the man she had once protected with all the love she had. "No, Nolan," she said quietly. "You lost access to what was never yours." Behind him, Leela arrived holding a sealed envelope from the court. Mara already knew the next door to close would not be made of glass. It would be legal, and Nolan would finally have to answer without her saving him. The moving truck blocked the same driveway where Nolan had once thrown Mara's suitcase into the rain. For one sharp second, Mara could not breathe. The stone was dry now. The sky was pale and clear. No storm, no wet clothes, no wedding photo face down in a puddle, but her body remembered. Her hands remembered the cold folder pressed against her chest. Her ears remembered Nolan shouting that she was financially useless while Paige stood dry beneath his umbrella. Now, weeks later, Mara returned to the mansion through the same open gate, not as the rejected wife, not as the woman they pushed into the rain. She returned as the managing chair of Hale Finch Estate Management, the company worth $240 million, the company that had protected Grant Vale's properties long before Nolan knew her name was attached to the work. The moving truck was not there for Mara's belongings. It was there for estate records. Grant had ordered every filing box, vendor archive, property schedule, and compliance binder removed from Nolan's private office wing and transferred into secured Hale Finch custody. No one would hide important papers in a family study again. No one would mix personal pride with estate control again. Cal stood near the gate. When he saw her car, he stepped forward and opened it himself. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale Vale," he said. Mara paused at the name. She had started using Hale again in business, but the legal divorce was still moving through court. Hearing both names together felt like standing between the woman who loved Nolan and the woman who survived him. "Good morning, Cal," she said. The mansion staff stood quietly near the entrance. June was there too, holding a small folder to her chest. Her eyes softened when Mara stepped out of the car. No one whispered. No one laughed. No one looked at Mara like she was background furniture. This time everyone moved aside for her. At the top of the front steps, Nolan stood alone. He looked smaller than Mara remembered. Not physically. He still wore an expensive suit. His hair was still neat. His face was still the face that once made rooms turn toward him, but something around him had collapsed. Without access to estate accounts, without board influence, without Ruth controlling the room, without Paige smiling beside him, Nolan looked like a man standing in a house that had stopped obeying him. There was no luxury watch on his wrist. Mara noticed that before she could stop herself. Near a side entrance, Paige appeared briefly with 2 sealed garment bags and a small box in her hands. She did not wear cream. She wore grey, plain and forgettable. A staff member walked beside her, not as a servant, but as a witness. Paige's returned items had been logged, photographed, and tagged by Leela's office. Paige saw Mara. For the first time, she looked away first. The woman who had once used Nolan's jacket like a crown now left through a side door like a vendor whose contract had been cancelled. Inside the front window, Ruth stood half hidden behind the curtain. She did not come outside. Her pearls were still around her neck, but they no longer looked powerful. They looked like something she held onto because everything else had slipped from her hands. The woman who once said Mara had no family money now knew Mara controlled the file that had saved the estate. Mara walked toward the front steps with Leela beside her. Leela carried the long-term management contract. Grant had called for one final authorized estate meeting. The board would witness it. The senior staff would hear it. Nolan would have no control over it. Nolan stepped down before Mara reached the door. "Mara," he said. Leela stopped beside her. Mara lifted one hand slightly, letting Leela know she could handle it. Nolan looked toward the driveway, then back at her. Maybe he remembered the rain too. Maybe he remembered the suitcase. Maybe he remembered the ring she left on the hood of his car. "I was angry," he said. "My mother kept telling me you were using me." Paige got in my head. "I didn't know who you were." Mara looked at him for a long moment. That was the saddest part. He still thought her power was the thing he should have respected. "You knew I loved you," she said. "That should have been enough to treat me better." The words hit him harder than an accusation. His mouth opened, then closed. Mara looked at the exact place where her suitcase had split open. For a moment. The past rose around her in flashes. The storm, Paige beneath the umbrella, Ruth's cold voice, Nolan shouting, "You are financially useless," her father's pen in her hand, the tax file opening, the whole family silent. Then she saw herself walking away through the gate, broken but still holding the proof. Nolan's voice softened. "Can we start over?" Mara felt the old pain move inside her, but it did not control her anymore. "No," she said. "I'm not rebuilding a life where I had to disappear for you to feel important." Nolan looked down. For once, he had no speech prepared. Mara walked past him into the mansion. The final estate meeting was held in the same review room where the file had been opened. Grant sat at the head of the table, pale but steady. Vera and the board members sat on one side. Leela stood near Mara. June and several senior staff members were present because Grant had asked them to witness his statement. Ruth sat at the far end of the room. She did not speak. Brent stood near the back wall, stripped of the easy arrogance he once carried like a family uniform. Nolan remained near the door, close enough to hear everything, far enough to understand he no longer controlled the table. Grant signed the long-term contract slowly. Hale Finch would remain the estate manager. Mara would remain the lead authority over compliance, tax filings and property protection. All estate filings would require board review, documented approval, and direct confirmation from Grant while he was competent to give it. When Grant finished, he placed the pen down and looked at the room. "This estate survived," he said, "because a woman we underestimated kept better faith with our name than the people born into it." Mara lowered her eyes. She did not want to cry in front of them. Not because crying was weakness, but because this moment was not about pain anymore. It was about repair, not romantic repair, not family pretending nothing happened, professional respect, moral truth, a wrong finally named out loud. Grant looked at her. "I cannot undo what happened on that driveway," he said, "but I can make sure no one in this family ever mistakes silence for uselessness again." Ruth's eyes filled, but Mara could not tell if it was shame or loss. Nolan stared at the table. Paige was gone. The whole family was silent again, but this silence was different from the first one. The first silence had come from shock. This one came from understanding. Mara signed the contract beneath Grant's signature. Her hand did not shake. The same hand that had gathered wet papers from the driveway now held legal authority over the records Nolan had tried to hide. When the meeting ended, June approached Mara near the hallway. "I saved something," June said softly. She opened the small folder. Inside was the wedding photo from the driveway, now dried, flattened and placed in a protective sleeve. The edges were still damaged from the rain. Mara touched the sleeve gently. For a second, grief rose again. Then she realized the photo no longer had power over her. It was not proof that she had failed as a wife. It was proof that she had loved honestly, even in a house that did not deserve her silence. "Thank you, June," Mara said. June nodded, her eyes wet. Outside, the moving truck doors closed. Boxes of estate records were sealed, labeled, and loaded under Hale Finch supervision. The driveway no longer looked like the place where Mara had been thrown away. It looked like the place where the truth had returned to collect what belonged to it. Mara stepped outside alone. Nolan stood near his car, staring at the hood where her wedding ring had once rested. The ring was gone now. Maybe he had kept it. Maybe he had thrown it into a drawer. Maybe he looked for it sometimes and remembered the exact second she stopped begging to be seen. Mara did not ask. She no longer needed answers that only reopened wounds. Grant's voice came from behind her. "Mara," she turned. He stood in the doorway with Elaine beside him and Cal nearby, both ready if he needed help. "You are free to leave through the side gate," Grant said gently. "You do not have to walk this driveway again." Mara looked at the long stone path. The same path. The same gate, the same place where Nolan had tried to reduce her to nothing. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. "I will walk out the way they made me leave, but this time I will not be carrying shame." She walked down the driveway slowly. No suitcase burst open behind her. No one laughed. No one called her useless. At the gate, Mara stopped and looked back once, not because she wanted the mansion, not because she wanted Nolan, but because the woman who had walked out in the rain deserved to see this ending. Then Mara turned away from Grant Vale's mansion and walked toward her waiting car, her father's pen in her bag, her company's contract signed, and her name restored by the very records they thought would bury her. The driveway had held her humiliation for one day, but it could not hold her future. And if this story reminds you of someone who was mocked, underestimated, or pushed aside before the truth finally spoke for them, subscribe now and stand with every quiet person who was never useless, only unseen.